Thank you both for joining me on The Same Drugs. I've interviewed you both before, and I love talking with you, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to chat with you once again.
We are both really glad to be back here. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks for having us.
So this was a super fascinating book, your new book, which I'll show the audience. I have it right here. It's also very beautiful. I love the cover. But
thank you.
So it's called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and Challenges of Modern Life. Why did you feel it was important to write this book right now? I mean, evolution has always been fascinating to people, but why now? Why did you want to talk about this right now?
Well, I think we wanted to get it done before our species extinction. It just made sense to do it while the writing was still possible.
Yeah, that is one answer, I suppose.
Good
it's
call.
True. Yeah, I mean, at some level, we had the opportunity. It's a book we've been talking about writing since we started being college professors, which is now receding into memory. But we were working on these ideas both in grad school and then as college professors, and our students would tell us that they would like to have some encapsulation of the kinds of thinking that we were teaching them so that they could share it more widely with their friends. But when we were still college professors at a small public liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest, it would have been very hard to get this book out there. And so having a platform now, we were able to find a publisher and an amazing agent and just an amazing team of people who helped us figure out how to do it now. And as it turns out, it just seems more and more relevant with every passing day, week, month, year.
I mean, it's funny because talking about evolution and even just, the word nature or natural and evolution, it seems like it's triggering to a certain group of people. Obviously, feminists, perhaps leftists, perhaps the woke. And I think I understand why, partly because I think that those kinds of conversations were at one point triggering to me as a feminist. Because I think there's a concern that if you say something is natural, then people assume that what you mean is that something is inevitable or inherent or that you can't change it. And so for feminists, for example, they might be concerned that in talking about rape in nature or rape as sort of a product of evolution, that you would be saying, well, this is natural, there's nothing that we can do about it. How do you respond to those kinds of, or that kind of pushback or that kind of reaction?
Well, I think one of the central themes of the book is that there are at least two important ways in which evolutionary adaptive information is transmitted through time in our species. And one of them is the software layer, where we are more software-based than any other creature. We are not blank slates, but we are the blankest slates that natural selection has ever produced. And what that means is that we have a great deal more flexibility to alter things in our program than other creatures do. It also is the case that if you take something like rape, which you mentioned, it is an evolutionary strategy, but it is in competition with other evolutionary strategies to shut down that pathway. And so there's nothing about the fact that something does emerge from our history that makes it good. The naturalistic fallacy is indeed a fallacy, and we go to great lengths to point that out. But it is also the case that we are in no way obligated to evolution's program or any one of its competing programs going forward. One of the things that we argue we have to do is renegotiate our relationship with each other so that it works better.
Yeah, there are some things that we're not going to change by wishing it so. Women will be the ones who gestate and lactate, right? But so much about what we have been handed by our evolutionary past is in fact flexible. And many, many of the things that we imagine aren't flexible, in fact, are. Even things like skeletal structure are context dependent on early developmental environment. So the idea that if it's evolutionary, it can't be changed is wrong. And the idea that if it's evolutionary, it's therefore good is wrong. And the idea that if it's evolutionary, it is the only way forward and the only possible avenue is also wrong. So all of those are sort of somewhat naive but very popular misunderstandings of what it means to say that something is evolutionary.
Mm. And one of the, majorly controversial issues of today, and I think, again, one of the issues that feminists might be triggered by or take issue with in terms of evolutionary biology, again, another term that seems like it's triggering for people, is, of course, gender and gender roles. So I just want to talk about some really basic stuff that you guys mention in your book. I mean, I don't want to stereotype myself, but I was in Austin recently to do Rogan, and I was going to a steakhouse that was like 2 blocks from my hotel. And I asked for directions, like from the guy in the lobby. I also looked up how to get, again, 2 blocks away. I looked up the steakhouse on Google Maps. So I was like looking at my phone while trying to get to the restaurant. And I still went in the wrong directions 3 different times. I'm not exaggerating. 3 different times I went the wrong way. I went every single possible wrong way that you could go. And so it made
sound
me
like chance, Megan.
And so it did make me think. I'm like, is there something evolutionary? Is it actually true that women are worse with than men, or have a worse sense of direction than men? I mean, I'm willing to believe that there's some foundation for what surely isn't just my problem, or maybe it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, as with all of these things, we're talking at a population level, right? So talking about the fact, just to take the easiest, least politicizable one, are men taller than women? Yes. Does that mean that all men are taller than all women? No. Does that mean that some women might be taller than any men? Sure, it's possible, but it's unlikely. So as with all of these things, we're talking about population level differences, which is to say, overlapping distributions where you've got most men and women sort of at levels of capacity that are indistinguishable from one another. But with regard to wayfinding, actually, there's some interesting research out that I believe we cite in the book, actually, that finds exactly this, actually, that across several, I think it's sensory and neurological domains, on average, men seem to be better at what the authors of the research called gist level thinking, which is like the forest, like seeing the larger patterns. And women tend to be better at the detail level stuff. So whereas you might not be able, if say you were driving somewhere farther away with a guy friend, you might not have been as good at getting there once you're in the car. But in terms of finding the keys to the car, you probably would have been better at finding them. And yes, that's a stereotype. And as with many stereotypes, there is a modicum of truth at the population level to that thing that we have in our heads.
It's also the case, though, that even if this pattern is exactly what we expect, that does not imply what most people will imagine. It doesn't mean that this is written into our genes in an inflexible way. It is quite possible that such a pattern is the result of some kind of reinforcement that has been natural in development, which, if that's the way it happens, is open to renegotiation. And if it is written in our genes, then it's something that we would be more likely to simply have to accept or to have to compensate for if we wanted to change it. But much of what we are is an interaction between genes that set something in motion and patterns that emerge neurologically during development. And there's a great deal of flexibility. There's certain things that are non-negotiable, but the lion's share is actually alterable by changing the environment in which we raise kids.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know about other sort of patterns in behavior that divide on gender gender lines, but I mean, I suppose that it might be useful to explain what you guys mean when you're talking about gender versus sex, just for the audience, because I find that those words are confused.
Yeah, they're often conflated, right? So, I mean, sex is the thing that has been with us for, depending on how you count, at least 500 million years in an uninterrupted line of our ancestors, or perhaps more like 1.5 to 2 billion years. Certainly sex has been on the planet for something between 1 and 2 billion years. So sex is is the way that two individuals bring their genomes together in order to engage in sexual reproduction. And in all of those species that have two sexes, there's one that has a gamete that's big and rich and full of cytoplasm, full of the cellular machinery, and it doesn't move much. And we call that an egg, and we call organisms with eggs females. And there's one gamete that doesn't have any of the cellular machinery. And so when those two things come together, they don't have to fight over whose cellular machinery to use, but it's zippy. And so it's light, it's streamlined, it moves around. And in plants, we call that pollen. In animals, we call that sperm. And those individuals that have either pollen or sperm, we call males. And of course, in plants, for instance, there are often individuals that have both male and female parts, and we call those hermaphrodites. But that maleness and femaleness, which emerges from what type of gamete you have, is ancient. And gender is downstream of that. So sex is binary, gender isn't. Gender is sort of, Bret and I have slightly different approaches to defining what gender is, but I think of it as the behavioral manifestation of sex. And, behavior is absolutely evolutionary, and it's also clearly even more flexible, even more labile than, muscle mass or skeletal structure. And so the fact that we have inherited gender roles and gender norms from our long evolutionary history does not mean that we are beholden to almost any of them, nor does it mean that they are inherently relevant in the modern world.
That said, it is important, especially in the context of the kinds of battles that we get into on questions of gender in modern times. It's important to recognize that some of these patterns, they may not be written in the genes at all, but once you have these two different size gametes, certain strategies follow each of the two types. And you can tell this because in plants, you see the same dichotomy in terms of enthusiasm for sex with strangers. You see the same dichotomy between the male parts and the female parts, even in a plant that has both. So in a plant that has both, the ovules are reluctant to be fertilized. They put the pollen grains to a test effectively, whereas the pollen grains are more or less indiscriminate. They should attempt to fertilize whatever they land on. And the fact that that pattern is readily detectable in plants and animals, which got their maleness and femaleness separately, is quite telling. Now, it doesn't mean that for us it isn't housed in the software layer, but as we renegotiate it, we need to realize that this is not a pattern that was inflicted by somebody on others for their own benefit. This is a pattern we inherited for evolution. It's up for renegotiation, but we are liable to have to renegotiate it within certain boundaries.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know about some of the specifics around, those patterns in behavior and where they come from. You guys talk about, for example, the fact that women tend to be more agreeable or anxious. What does that mean, and why would women tend to be more agreeable or anxious than men?
Yeah, well, I think those are two different things, but they are both related to the fact that in humans, as there aren't that many species that have adult males and adult females living together in social groups. But in those few other species in which that is the case, there are separate male hierarchies and female hierarchies. And we see that in humans as well. And part of our modern dilemma is figuring out how to come together and create sort of a two-sex hierarchy. When what's true is that there are different rules for both establishing and maintaining hierarchies in males and in females. And those rules are not new to humans. We, of course, have done, we've elaborated on them and we've talked about them a lot and we've confused ourselves about what they mean. But the kinds of rules that decide male hierarchy are the same as in baboons, say. And they tend to be around physical size, and disagreements tend to be decided overtly not, you don't go to fighting first, but you are direct about what it is, whether or not you have a disagreement. And there's no, shuffling around behind the scenes and seeing if maybe he won't notice. Males tend to go at disagreement and at questions of hierarchy very directly. And by contrast, female hierarchies, again, in humans and baboons and any species that has female hierarchies, and there are many of them, the hierarchies are tending to be more covert in terms of how it is that they are both created and maintained. And why might that be the case? That itself is a very interesting question. Some of it is going to be about when in engagement with males, women are obviously smaller, and so acting in physical ways will be less productive. And so having to be covert, having to be more social, having to work on the social level more explicitly will be more effective. And that then moves into the female hierarchies as well. So different rules, different rules for what hierarchy means and how it's maintained in males versus females, means then that the social interactions themselves being often maintained through covert means. I'm going to go talk to the friend of the person that I have a problem with at the moment, rather than talk to the person themselves directly. That's much more of a female typical than male typical move. And that's not just weird cultures. It's not just us in the West. It's not just humans. It's all of those species that have female hierarchies and male hierarchies. Again, it's rare that any species has both. But those things, again, are changeable. There's no reason in the modern world when we are working together and mostly have the opportunity to do the same work if we want to, whether or not we're male or female, that we should be playing by different rules. But pretending that we don't inherit different rules, that we haven't been acting by different rules for millions of years is foolish, because it means that we're basically fated to repeat some of the errors of our past.
Much of the distinction actually has to do with the fact that although in a population in which sex ratios are even at birth, which is true for most creatures, there is an even level of expected success for males and females, but a much different level of variance. Males are high variance creatures. That is to say, when they succeed, they tend to succeed spectacularly, but there are an awful large number of failures in male space, whereas females tend to be much more likely to succeed. But when they do, you can just look at the way we reproduce. A female is limited in terms of how many offspring she can produce in life. And that's true. It's especially true for something like humans, where babies are so expensive to raise. But it's even true for creatures that don't invest in their offspring after they've hatched, for example. Just the simple difference in gamete size puts a much greater limit on female success than males, where, in humans, a very successful male might produce thousands of offspring. The largest number for a female is still a very impressive number. It's something like 60, but it's still double digits. So that high variance in males compared to lower variance in females, while having the same average success, suggests different strategies that will function, and it creates a different dynamic that we see in modern human behavior.
Yeah, in short, if you are of a population, if you're a male, and you could succeed wildly and you could fail wildly, and it's not clear which it's going to be, you're more likely to be the kind of person who's going to take risks. And so we would predict, and then of course we see, on average, males being greater risk takers, more likely to be explorers, more likely to be adventurers, and more likely never to come back. Right. And so when, males are more likely to succeed wildly, off the charts, and also to fail wildly. This is true across many domains. It's true for intelligence, for instance. Average intelligence for men and women is the same when it's been measured well. But the variance is much higher in men. So you have more male geniuses and more male idiots than you do women in either category. And does the first part of that irritate some feminists, and does the second part make some feminists pleased? Well, if so, that doesn't make any sense, because it's opposite halves of the same distribution. That it is in that case, in the case of intelligence, it is a symmetrical distribution. And so the spread is just wider for men.
I would just add one last thing. One of the things that we argue in the book is that it is time for a renegotiation between the sexes, that we can't go back. There's nowhere to go back to that would make any sense in the present, and that simply removing all of the rules of the way the sexes interact doesn't function either. So what we have to do is effectively build some sort of new structure. This leaves us open to do exactly what we actually have done over the last half a century, where women have joined the provinces that were once held exclusively by men and have done brilliantly and have contributed in a very spectacular way. But the important thing to understand is that the ways that men used to interact before women were in those realms are liable to be somewhat arbitrary, but they are also liable to have certain patterns that were necessary to their functioning. So, for example, the kinds of pushing each other around that one might do in a laboratory environment or in a skunk works where innovation is created. That kind of jockeying for position is essential to the process in play. And so it is very likely that to the extent that women are succeeding better and better in these environments, that it will in part be by adopting some of those patterns. And there's nothing wrong with that. We should expect it and we should foster it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more controversial issues around gender roles and this question of, what's natural for women and what's natural for men is the division of labor in the home, for example, but also, I mean, what women and men do out in the world in terms of work and things like that. But I mean, it seems like, some people will say like there's this movement towards going back to traditional gender roles, like which would be a backlash against feminism. Feminism has tried to force equality on men and women, and this is unnatural. And really, women are supposed to be in the home and doing certain jobs in the home, and men are supposed to be out in the world and not doing that kind of domestic work. But I mean, at the same time, I mean, both of those arguments can go too far. And I think one of the ways that it can go too far on maybe the feminist end of things is that gender roles and the division of labor are not inherently a bad thing. There are probably some things that women are more inclined to do, and probably that has something to do with evolution. But at the same time, of course, it doesn't mean that men can't and shouldn't share in those roles more, especially as we're living in a world where, most families, both people are working. We don't live in a kind of situation where most families like can have one person staying at home and only one person working. But I want to talk about some of the reasons why, that division of labor may have happened, and why a division of labor in terms of gender roles is not inherently a bad thing. I mean, it can become a bad thing, but it's not necessarily always been a bad thing. Like it's not always been inherently degrading or oppressive for women and men to have different roles in terms of what they do in life.
One of my favorite pieces of research that I used to teach with a lot and that we raise in the book is by two anthropologists. It's a survey of what was known, I think they published it in 1973, a survey of 180 maybe pre-industrial societies in which gender roles were looked at. And they looked at 50, I believe, activities that people in these societies engaged in, things that were not anatomically or physiologically mandated. So they didn't look at pregnancy, they didn't look at breastfeeding, but they looked at all manner of other things, everything from making nets for fishing, weaving, gathering foods, hunting small mammals, hunting large mammals, hunting marine mammals, smelting ores, bringing water, cooking vegetable foods, cooking meat, and on and on and on. So all 50 different activities that you can imagine that many societies, they're pre-industrial, might engage in, but of course not all of them. And for each of these societies, the authors assessed the anthropological literature for, is this an entirely male activity? Like actually females never engage in it, and if they try, they would be forbidden from doing it. Is this an entirely female activity, or is it one of 3 gradations in between? Is it really, it just doesn't matter, this is not gendered at all, that would get a 3 on this scale. Or is it mostly male, but sometimes women do it, or is it mostly female and sometimes men do it? And there are 2 really fascinating things about the results. One is that there are few activities across all of the societies in which these authors looked that are really strictly male. And they are the hunting of marine mammals and the smelting of metal ores and timbering, logging. Okay. So extraordinarily dangerous, high risk, high reward, but the high chance of dying and not coming back activities. And in every society that they looked at, again, pre-industrial. So, post-industrial societies, women can be loggers, of course, but in pre-industrial societies, in those cases where tree felling is part of the activity, it's always male. In those societies, pre-industrial societies where hunting whales is an activity, it's always done by males. So there are, by contrast, in this research, no activities that are entirely done by women. There are plenty of activities that tend to be women typical, but nothing that is absolutely entirely the domain of women. And then the thing that I found most fascinating about this research is that there are many activities that are highly gendered in pretty much every society where they happen, things like weaving, but which sex does it varies by society. And so weaving, for instance, is an example where wherever weaving happens, it tends to be either a male activity and women are strongly discouraged from engaging in it, or a female activity and men are strongly discouraged from engaging in it. But it flips by society. And so that tells us there's nothing inherent about being male or being female that makes you better at weaving. There's absolutely nothing about it, but that there is value in the division of labor itself. And so that's one of the places that I tend to go when I think about division of labor, that there is absolutely value in division of labor. If we were married, if we decided that what we needed to do in order to feel equitable in our home was not just try to, feel good about what the work that we were doing and the work that the other was doing was, but, for each single task, each of us does 50% of it, that would be really inefficient and would piss both of us off. And I think anyone who's been in a relationship, straight or not, will recognize that if you try to exactly split every task in half, it's not going to make for a good relationship or a clean house, frankly, right? So division of labor has value, and that doesn't mean that you won't be left with some tasks you don't like, or that you won't feel that there's some unfairness sometimes. But it's not mostly division of labor actually has very little to do with the fact of being male or female, but just the fact that male and female are real categories, and so it's an easy axis along which to divide some tasks.
So I would point out that there's a tremendous amount in the historical patterns of what men and women do that is simply uncontroversially downstream of the asymmetrical roles in reproduction. The fact that human females both gestate and lactate is an unfudgeable fact. That fact has much smaller implications for us modern folk, especially after the invention of reliable birth control, because what it means is that although those things are still entirely the province of women, that they are things that can be planned around, that one can decide how many offspring they're going to produce, when in life they're going to do it, and therefore can usefully organize a career around it. Or they can decide not to have offspring at all. And so we have flexibility that's very real. And frankly, it's a gift. But the lesson of that gift has not been well understood. It basically has obliterated our sense that we need a system that is coherent, right? Because we are now able to plan and can decide to do what we want. The idea, then why? What else is there to say? We are equal, have always been equal, to the extent that there are differences in the numbers of individuals of each sex that show up in a particular realm and as the result of oppression of one kind or another. These things are all nonsense. The fact is, things were much more constrained by reproduction. They're much less constrained now, and we have to figure out what to do with that gift in order to end up with a system that still works. But we should be grateful for that gift before we get around to figuring out what it actually hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that I'm sort of perpetually interested in is the way that we engage in relationships, the way that we have sex, and those things are so tied to reproduction, but at the same time, in the modern world, often they aren't. Often people, obviously, humans have the gift of being able to have sex for pleasure, which most animals don't. Not everybody wants to reproduce, and yet people still continue to engage in relationships, often to engage in long-term monogamous relationships. And then of course there's the fact of things like casual sex that you guys talk about in your book. You talk about 3 different reproductive strategies, and 2 of those reproductive strategies, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you sort of view those as bad ways to operate. One of those obviously is rape, and the other one is one night stands and casual sex. Is that, I mean, before I say that, are you sort of lumping in casual sex with one night stands, or is that kind of the same thing?
They obviously belong together in a category, and I'm not sure there's any value in really parsing between them.
Okay.
But I think the point is, this is not us wagging our finger at people wanting to enjoy sex. This is about what happens when we just simply remove all the coherence from the system. So you had ancestrally a system in which women were extremely careful about with whom they had sex. Why? Because the cost of raising an offspring is so high that it would be foolish to engage in behavior that could cause you to do that without some evidence, strong evidence, in fact, from a partner that they were willing to participate in that child rearing. And it doesn't necessarily mean the direct work of the child rearing. It might be in the form of providing resources or protection or all of these things. But the point was, as between the 2 branches of the tree, one where you have no partner who will invest and one in which you have a partner who's committed, one of these is vastly better for women than the other. Now, birth control removes the rules because, of course, you can have sex without evidence of the person's willingness to commit, and it doesn't necessarily cost you anything because there's no baby produced unless you want there to be one. But the problem is, on the other side, really, men have 2 reproductive strategies in this schema. If we put rape to the side, men have the opportunity to reproduce with women who don't demand commitment and the opportunity to reproduce with women who do demand commitment. Now, women who don't demand commitment would have been very rare in the past for reasons I just went through. But it doesn't mean that men aren't looking for evidence of that, because in those rare cases in the past when it happened, it's such a bargain. A woman who will raise a child, after a single night with you, right, without demanding your participation in it, she is doing all of the work. It's an evolutionary bargain at an extraordinary level. So men are looking for this. And to the extent that modern men are confused by the fact that women will have sex with them with no evidence of a long-term commitment, they have a hard time bringing themselves to the idea that actually long-term commitment is something that they should be interested in, which otherwise they would be, because that was the primary way in which males reproduced in the past. So we've built a system that confuses men, and it undercuts women's bargaining position when they do get to the point that they want a committed relationship.
Yeah, it confuses men in that it appeals to their worst instincts. So it appeals to their desire to game the system, game the woman, get in, get out, get gone. And, even when that can be actually what the woman is interested in, and she's not lying to herself at all, that's not going to bring out the best in that guy. Even if she really is only going to interact with him for a night or a couple days or something, she's by engaging in this, very rapid to sex relationship, she's likely brought out the absolute worst in him. And one thing that is true, and you alluded to this already, Megan, is that in humans, and there are a few other species that do this a little bit. We call them the usual suspects in the book, but there are some others that have long-lived, long childhood, social, generational overlap organisms that also have some of these remarkable characteristics that humans have, and humans have just exaggerated them. But just as for humans, food isn't just about sustenance. Food is also an opportunity to come together and to share through cooking your love, and to sit and commune with one another, and to break bread and to have conversation for long periods of time. So yes, we need calories, just like all of our ancestors have, but we use food for additional things that are actually just as necessary for humans. So too sex, right? Sex originally is obviously about reproduction. Sex wouldn't exist but for the fact of it tending to bring more individuals into the world. But for humans, it's far, far more than that. And indeed, for most of us, for most humans, the vast majority of sexual acts that we engage in have nothing to do with actual reproduction. And that doesn't mean, we're somehow going against nature. No, not at all. Sex is about connection and communion and relationship and, intensity coming together such that you can become more than the individual people who you were apart. And, there's nothing unnatural or anti-evolutionary about that perspective.
Not only is there nothing unevolutionary about it, but it was evolution that invented this. Right? The fact that human beings have sex when not fertile is an evolutionary adaptation. And the only good interpretation for why selection would have given us that is that it is about much more than reproduction, which doesn't mean that the whole point of the exercise, the whole point of monogamous bonding is ultimately reproductive. But the point is a strong bond between partners is the key. It's not about the exchange of gametes. It's about something much more important. It's about a team.
Yeah, I suppose in some ways it might be like a confusing time now, because at one time it was frowned upon socially to engage in casual sex, and marriage was, prioritized. It really wasn't okay for women in particular to be having sex before marriage or having casual sex. And now it's okay, and, women do enjoy sex, and women, I'm a woman, so I can't speak for men, but I think probably for most women, they do eventually want a long-term relationship, but not always, like women have casual sex for fun, perhaps not in the same way that men do, but they do and can enjoy it. And, there's no, I guess I wonder what is the question I'm asking? I wonder if you think that casual sex is worse for women than it is for men. Is there a downside to men having casual sex forever and never settling down into a committed relationship outside of reproduction? Say we're not talking about people who necessarily want to reproduce. Is there a downside to that? Are men hardwired towards relationships, or for them, is it really just about the reproductive aspect?
There's so much there. I know you have a ton to say in response.
I got a lot of explaining to do.
Yes, so much explaining. But one thing actually that I wanted to make sure we got to, I just wrote on the one and only one copy of our book that we have, is something that you actually just said to our teenage boys. So we have 2 teenage sons, and after the book was pressed, this is not in the book, but it is totally consistent with what we're talking about in there in the sections on relationship. What you said to our 17-year-old son, and maybe the 15-year-old as well, was when deciding who to have sex with, you shouldn't be interested in someone with whom you think there's absolutely no chance of a long-term relationship. And so that's not the same as saying you should never engage, you should never pursue someone unless it's marriage, right? That's not the same thing at all. But the idea that you might hop into bed with someone who you kind of hate, or you kind of think is gross, but you think they're hot right now, that's not particularly honorable. And, that's the level of casual sex that I feel, very comfortable saying, yeah, avoid that.
Yeah.
It's not good for either partner.
In the past, such a behavior was effectively a willingness to inflict a child on somebody with whom you had no intent to partner. Now, obviously, that's not what it means in the present. In the present, it can just be frivolous. But the point is, it borrows from something, and it's not a decent behavior. Now, that said, I don't expect most people to accept that because, I don't know, our modern sophistications or pseudo-sophistication suggests something very different. But in answer to your earlier question, the casual sex environment is actually bad for almost all men and all women. And you say women can have casual sex. Absolutely. But what they tend to find out is that they are wired to fall in love with guys they have sex with, right? That's an unfortunate wiring.
I've noticed that.
You've noticed that?
Fortunately.
But here's the thing on the other side, and this is the thing that I believe every young woman needs to know. And I don't think most men know this either, really. But because men have these two different reproductive strategies.
Again, putting aside rape, putting aside the obviously dishonorable one.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you can do various taxonomies, but for the moment, they have these two strategies. And
like long-term versus short-term.
Right.
Yeah.
They want to impregnate somebody, so and go, as one of my students put it, or they want to invest. In their investing mentality, men are not the same as women. They think about these long-term relationships differently, and they choose for different things, but they are very choosy, just like women are. In their so and go mode, men are not so choosy because it doesn't make sense to be, right? Simply fertilizing somebody doesn't, even if they are unlikely to be able to raise the child, it's a chance. It's a gamble that costs them very little. So what the bombshell is that men, as far as we know, and much of this work, I should say, is extrapolating from studies done in prairie voles, which may seem pretty remote, but the thing is, theoretically, this is so secure that the fact that we have seen it in prairie voles tells us something. The pattern is this: when females are willing to mate quickly with males, it puts males in a mindset where they are not interested in long-term investment. In other words, a male who is likely to invest will be placed into an anti-investment mindset by sex that comes too quickly. Whereas the chase results in a bond that actually lasts and results in investment. And so
this is some interesting endocrinological work actually in prairie voles, right?
Yes.
Like vasopressin and oxytocin.
Yep. So the problem is that our current pseudo-sophistications have set us up for a terrible dynamic, right? In which we're told everybody should be having casual sex. And then when people do, women find, oh, that wasn't so casual after all, because they fall for the guy, and the guy does the opposite, right? He becomes more reluctant about commitment. And so the point is that cannot help but result in misery. Whereas a certain delay on ending up in bed with somebody actually triggers all the right stuff. And what do you know? It also makes the sex pretty good because there's delayed gratification, which has a strong contributing role to play. So again, this is not us being prudish. This is us recognizing that this isn't the blank canvas we think it is. We're actually handed evolutionary dynamics and then handed a modern situation that doesn't match them. And we have to figure out how to meld those two so that what we come up with actually results in people being satisfied and effective at doing things like raising children.
Just like, I feel like, Megan, you and I talked when we spoke last time about reclaiming the word feminism, I think, or at least I know that you've thought about that and I've thought about that too. I'd love to reclaim the phrase sex positivity. Like, I'm wildly sex positive, but what is passing for sex positive right now looks really sex negative to me, actually, and woman negative and human negative.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and I've talked about that a bunch because, I don't think, as much as, I have had casual sex, but I agree with you that it's not a great strategy for women. And I think it's a bit of a lie. I think that sort of, third wave feminism and the modern world and porn culture and all of those things, even, the sexual revolution has taught women like, oh, you can have sex just like men. Like you can have casual sex. Sex is just for pleasure. But the reality is that I think I mean, this has happened to me. This happens to most women I know. And the women who say that it doesn't happen to them, I'm not sure if I believe them. But you have sex with a guy a few times and you have feelings for him and you start getting attached. And so it's a lie to tell yourself, oh, I can just have casual sex indefinitely. You know, maybe once or twice. But after a certain amount of time, if you keep bonding with another person in this way and engaging in this very intimate act with this other person, then you're going to fall in love with them, whatever falling in love means. Another thing we can talk about a bit later.
That's exactly right. And why should we be aspiring to act like men at their worst? Like, how is that a win for women?
The problem, though, if I can point out the predicament of women continuing in my pattern of mansplaining, the problem is a game theory problem. In a past environment, not so long ago, a woman who did not leap into bed was not in such a dire situation. But at the moment, because the present sophistications do involve an expectation of casual sex, a woman who opts out and says, actually, you know what, that doesn't work. I end up falling for the guy and then he doesn't fall for me. And what am I doing? Right? A woman who opts out suddenly has trouble getting male attention because she's competing with all sorts of women who haven't reached the same conclusion. Now, on the one hand, part of that is actually good. The attention that still remains will be higher quality attention. It won't be men just trying to get lucky. On the other hand, lots of guys who potentially would be the right guy aren't in the right mindset because they've been led to believe that, casual sex is the thing that they should be pursuing, and maybe someday they'll settle down or they won't. So anyway, the whole thing results in there being no good solution for an individual who wants to opt out. And what we hope is that recognizing that this is creating a lot of sexual dissatisfaction, among other things, that people,
in both men and women.
In both men and women. It really is not good for men. It may be more entertaining to them, but it's really not good for them. But to the extent that people realize that, they recognize their own dissatisfaction with their sex lives playing by those rules, that there will be an opt-out culture where people agree to some new set of rules about how they will treat each other that result in greater satisfaction, greater effectiveness, better teaming up together. And that would really be the logical next step.
I mean, I'm curious to talk just a little bit more about how this is bad for men, because I think a lot of men would, and I could argue based on my limited knowledge of evolution and reproduction, that it's not necessarily a bad thing for men to have perpetual casual sex. You know, the fact that you guys wrote this, but I've noticed this in real life also, that males tend to have incredibly low standards for sex partners. You know, like men, not all men, but men will have sex with almost anybody. You know, and it's kind of like, it's a turnoff for women. Like, and I'm not sure if men realize that, because I think that women who are higher quality are going to see that this man is just like having sex with anybody, you know, people that are not attractive, that aren't intelligent, that aren't respectable, that maybe these men don't actually even like as people. And it's like, well, why would I have sex with you if you're just going to have sex with anybody else? I'm not sure if men really get that. So, I mean, I started out by asking, why is it bad for men to have casual sex? I suppose that's one reason, but are there other reasons? And I mean, I wonder if men think about the fact that, like, it sort of lowers in my eyes, it lowers their quality. Like, if I see a man behaving like that, I'm like, well, like, then why would I be with you? Like, you clearly just choose anyone. Like, I want to be special. Anybody wants to be special. In a relationship, you want to feel chosen, not just, oh, well, I would fuck anybody and here you are. So, like,
yeah, no, I mean, you hit so many of the right points there. Like, because we are moving, behaviorally, anatomically, physiologically away from our polygamous past towards monogamy. Like, we're more similar to one another as men and women than we were 6 million years ago when we shared, before we split off with what would become the chimps and bonobos. So, we're moving into this more monogamous future. And part of what that means is that it's not just women who get to choose mates, it's men who get to choose mates, right? And so we're all choosy. We're all able to look around and actually make choice. And I mean, it's part of, I think, what was the undercurrent of the advice that you just gave to our teenage boys. Like, why in part should you not just have sex with anyone if you really think there's absolutely no chance that she could be a long-term partner? It's partly exactly what you were just saying, Megan. Like, you will make yourself look worse. You will lower yourself in the eyes of the awesome women out there whom you should be trying to attract.
Well, all right. I'm in some jeopardy saying the next thing here. It's something I don't even think should be controversial, but I know that it will cause trouble.
And I don't even know what's coming.
Right. You don't know what's coming. I don't think most men think this consciously, but I do think it is an undercurrent in frank male discussion, if you listen for it. Your bewilderment as women at men having sex with women who they do not respect or even like is missing how deep this actually goes, right? Remember what I was saying about pollen grains? Makes sense for the pollen grain to fertilize whatever it lands on. That is actually true even if it lands on the wrong species, right? Because the pollen grain isn't going anywhere else, right? The pollen grain that fertilizes the wrong species is actually getting genes into the future. It's an evolutionary success, and it's an unlikely strategy to work, but it's not impossible.
Very unlikely to work,
but the point is that from the pollen grain's point of view, it doesn't turn up its nose at the wrong species that it's landed on. It's like, well, all right,
let's give it a shot.
Let's give it a shot, right? It's getting late. So the problem, though, the thing that I know is going to cause trouble when I say it, is that if you divide these two male reproductive modes, the mode in which males are engaging in behavior that in the past would have fertilized females they had no intent on bonding with, teaming up with, helping, anything like that, that is in some sense an insult. The attraction that a male feels to a female that he does not respect, that he would have sex with but does not respect, right? That is his desire to stick her with his child and walk away. You don't want men in that mode. Men shouldn't want to be in that mode. Women should understand that that mode exists, and they should look askance at a man who does not divide these things in his own mind.
Yeah, it's an insult not just to the woman who is whatever it is, not attractive, not smart, not respectable, any of these words we've used, but it's an insult to all women, right? Like, it's an insult, the way that you set it up, Megan, is it's an insult to those of us who be looking, going like, well, I thought I might be interested in you, but if you're doing that, what the hell? Then I don't think I am, because I don't even understand your standards, and what would it mean if I then got together with you? What does that say that you're really thinking about me? It just raises all sorts of questions that don't need to be raised.
Right.
Really, and, why go there?
What I said to our boys is really me trying to be, the father that tells them what they need to know, which is that, yeah, there's some part of you that may want that, but that part of you is not an honorable part of you, right? So kill it off, right? It's not a good part. And, those who want to participate with it are maybe, not clear enough minded to be good partners. So, I don't know how we have this discussion.
And this is not a no premarital sex conversation, right? Not at all, in no way.
No, what I said to him was, don't have sex with people that aren't long-term prospects. At the point that, they should be not partners that you'll go to bed with. Which, means you'll forego some pleasure, but okay.
Yeah, it's not an honorable practice. It's not respectable. And I think that it'll make a man look like he can't make, you might have a better way of phrasing this, but then he can't make rational decisions about his own life. It makes him seem as though he's out of control in terms of his own behavior if he's looking at hitting on, trying to sleep with, or sleeping with, any woman, regardless of who she is or what he thinks about her or whatever.
Yeah. Well, but in some ways, it's even worse than this. And, the question you asked, how is this bad for men, right? Mm-hmm. It's bad for planet Earth, right, including men. And here's the worst part of it, maybe, is in the past, which was desperately unfair in many ways. It was arbitrarily asymmetrical, sexually speaking, right? Men fought wars and suffered greatly as a result of this. Women were saddled with child rearing and effectively barred from some of the most interesting professions by their biological obligations in reproduction, right? This was not a fair landscape. It was arbitrary and unfortunate in many ways. But because in that environment, women were so heavily selected to be choosy and extremely careful not to mate with a guy who wasn't going to contribute, it created a coherent dynamic. And in that environment, because frankly, sex with a woman is such a powerful incentive beyond really anything else in the known universe for men, right? In order to attain a relationship in which sex with a woman was going to occur, men had to be good enough to be chosen. And so this motivated a tremendous amount of accomplishment, right? It created a dynamic in which men actually figured out where the skills were in them to do important things. Now, I'm not arguing that we should go back to that world. I love living in a world where, here you are in broadcasting, right? This is a traditionally male province and you're doing beautifully at it. Heather and I have had the same job somehow weirdly for our entire careers, right? I'm not looking for a world in which men do men stuff and women do women stuff, but I am looking to recognize that the coherence, the motivation that came from that earlier world was an important part of why we got to the moon and everything else that we could describe in similar terms. And
so we need to need to create some new incentive structures and not pretend that the old ones didn't exist.
Right. We need to leverage what we've got. And the punchline to that joke is women do not realize how spectacularly their bargaining position has been undercut by this current supposedly sex positive environment. Their bargaining position has, evaporated. And that's an unfortunate consequence of our being naive about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this meme going around, and this messaging has been sent to women, I think, probably for the past 20 years. I have a hard time thinking about decades because I think that 20 years ago is much longer ago than it actually is. Like, okay, yeah, probably 20 years, which is like, do what you want, be kinky, get paid, like, watch porn, be in porn, have sex with who you want. You do you, girl. And, and I've spent like 10 years trying to convince women that that's not really true or good. I guess one of the things I wanted you to clarify is this. You talk about the difference between hotness and beauty. And I'm not even sure I think I understand a little bit what you mean, but not entirely. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So imagine that actually these are the descriptors for appealingness to the two male strategies, right? So the male strategy that is looking to get lucky tonight and not interested in investing, and in fact, the opposite of interested in investing, he's looking for an urgent sexual message, right? That's hot. Beauty is about the characteristics that actually would make a fine partner. Now, the confusing thing is that a woman can have both of these things. And in some sense, a woman may be inflicted with hotness by youth, right? Because part of what males are looking for is fertility cues, right? And so fertility comes in a lot of forms. In the past, our ancestors would have been chronically undernourished. So a woman who was well nourished, well enough to bring a child into the world and raise it would have had the curvaceousness that would have indicated those resources, and that would be very positive. Youth has a strong contributing factor in this equation because of the likelihood of bringing a child into the world and raising it to adulthood, for example. But anyway, the point is males are cueing on both characteristics. But, and I asked Joe Rogan this to make sure that I was not imagining something, and it went well with Joe. It is readily possible to think of examples of women who are hot but not beautiful, beautiful but not hot, and both or neither. right? And so that suggests these are really independent parameters that are pointing to different values.
And I'd love to just talk a little bit, this phrase that you used that I've never heard you use before, and I think both Megan and I immediately responded to it. The idea that young women may be inflicted with hotness, right? Yeah. And, basically, if you were anywhere near the beauty norms for your culture when you were young as a woman, coming of age, suddenly everything changes. And this is the smart part of what feminist theory is talking about when it talks about things like the male gaze, right? Suddenly, oh my God, you can't escape. Suddenly, and some women respond by just dressing in sacks, right? And some women respond by showing off everything. And most of us do some sort of middle walk, going like, wow, I have a kind of power I never even imagined before. And I know for sure that this will evaporate at some point. And unless this is the only thing I want to be in the world, I should not try to maximize this power, right? I should not try to maximize and magnify this power, because that will mean that I cannot accomplish the other things, or I will at least sacrifice some of my capacity to accomplish the other things in the world. But here I am, and just, most young women have this, and it is both empowering and an affliction, and there's no escaping from it. And that's not, I'm not saying boo hoo for us who had that, but it is difficult to navigate, and pretending that the answer is simply, flaunt it if you got it. Nope. That's going to cause problems probably for you. Even if we just talk about like being taken seriously, and being able to, put whatever else it is that you want to do in the world. If what you're doing is advertising hot, that is the thing. That is the single note that will be remembered. And so, just to take it out of like the sexual realm for a moment, I used to give students basically a presentation on how to give presentations before they would give talks, scientific talks. And one of the things I would say was, you're here to talk about your science, not about your hat. So don't, unless you want people only to remember your hat, don't wear something, don't wear the hat that's going to be memorable, because that's what will be remembered, not your science. And I think this message applies everywhere, right? If what you're doing is dressing provocatively, imagining that will get you in the door and then you'll get a different kind of attention. No, you're going to get that one kind of attention, and it's going to be very hard to switch out.
Yeah, and so I appreciate you saying that, because I didn't really complete my thought when I started talking about that meme and that message of women being told, like, do what you want, like flaunt your body, be kinky, do porn, make money, yada, yada, yada. But just, that today, I think young women do feel like that's what they're supposed to do, and that just in general, that everybody else is doing it, so they may as well. But also that's what they're supposed to do to get a man, like post like porny photos on the internet, or start an OnlyFans account, or produce porn, or like things like watch porn with your partner, or go to strip clubs with your partner and take pole dance. Like, you're supposed to be this like hyper sexualized being, just only in terms of appearance, because none of this stuff necessarily has to do with actual sexual pleasure, right? This is just about people looking at you and getting validation and trying to turn men on. And it's such a confused message, because I don't think that it achieves actually what women want, which, I mean, lie about as much as want, but most women do want to be in a relationship. They want to be in a long-term monogamous relationship. And I don't think that you need to send nudes to strangers on the internet, or flirt with strangers on the internet, or post porny photos in order to do that. And in fact, it sounds like that might actually have the opposite effect.
Exactly. It's counterproductive. Exactly. I mean, that's the main message of that little tiny part of the book, right?
Yeah. And, another way to think about this is you've got two competing ways in which women can be powerful and important in the world. And if we default to thinking that the hotness thing is the height of femininity, then we get a world in which women experience the height of their power on the cusp of sexual maturity, and it degrades rapidly over time, right? That's not a world you want to live in. You don't want women who don't really know anything because they're, just barely not children, as the most powerful woman around. You want women who have accomplished things, who've have wisdom and know how things work. And I guess I would say it is also important. I think women don't know that the eyes of men do not work the way they think they do. Yes, men react to hotness, but beauty is a very different parameter. And the fact is it doesn't decay the way hotness does, right? Hotness has a lot to do with youth. Beauty doesn't. There are beautiful women in their 40s, 50s, 60s. It's a very different parameter, and it is consistent with a world in which what makes women powerful is accomplishment, insight, grace, all of those other characteristics. And really, that's a better world to live in.
I wanted to ask you a bit about, because I was grateful that you included this these points or analysis in the book. I know that I'm picking up on some things from one specific chapter, but that's just because those are the things that I'm interested in. There's lots of other interesting things in the book also, but we only have an hour. And you guys talked about pornography and the fact that porn isn't good for men. And I have spent so many years trying to convince men that porn isn't good for them. And I think I have managed to convince a lot of men that porn isn't good for them, to be honest, because people email me and because I have friends who've decided to stop watching porn and things like that. And one aspect of that is just that most men, especially young men, have never been told that porn isn't good for them. They just assume that it's this neutral thing and everybody uses it and it's harmless and it's just fantasy, and it's basically the same as masturbation. And I know that because when I criticize pornography, men will say, "Oh, you don't think men should masturbate?" And I'm like, nope, you can do whatever you want. I'm talking about porn specifically. Like, they can't even separate the two anymore. But I thought that the angle that you two took was useful and convincing, which I appreciate. And again, because it's so rare for people to talk about the fact that porn really isn't good for you. Like, it's so normalized, and I find it really, I don't know, depressing, I guess, and obviously a bit disturbing in some ways. But I wonder if you can explain your perspective on porn.
Yeah, super fascinating and unnerving that men are conflating masturbation with porn. Frankly, it hadn't occurred to me that people would be actually unable to separate those two. But we argue, we invent a phrase in the book. We say that porn creates a kind of what we call sexual autism. And we are not, we are no way talking about actual autistic people, but we borrow basically the diagnosis, the criteria for what autism is, and the fact that people with autism have different responses to social interactions and have a tendency to engage in repetitive behavior and expect repetitive things back when they engage in repetitive behavior. That makes it difficult for them to have relationships in some cases with other people. And we then, without getting into what autism is or, what is causal with regard to autism, porn, we argue, creates a kind of sexual autism in that by having fantasies with things, with pictures and videos that cannot respond to you, that are entirely inert with regard to what it is that you do with them or to them or at them, it creates this sense that that's what sex is. And that when you actually do have a real living, breathing human being in front of you, with you, potentially interested in engaging with you sexually, you are more likely to be repetitive, to try the same tricks that you learned in porn just over and over and over again, to not even know what it would be like to respond to a person's pleasure or pain, to a person, engaging in such a way that it clearly is, oh, that's wonderful, do more of that, or, this isn't working for me. And, there's no problem with masturbation, right? Like you're responding to your own body, and you're not going to learn anything about anyone else's body that way. But it's totally different from porn, because porn exactly creates this sense that, especially that women enjoy things that most women don't enjoy, and that because you can watch the same thing over and over and over again, that a woman will always respond the same way to a particular to input, and it's just not what humans are, and it's certainly not what sex is supposed to be.
I think there are a couple other things that need to be in the discussion here. One, it is important, especially if you're going to reach people with this question. Porn is so normalized that you're right. It's very hard to compel people there's anything wrong with it. The fact, what we say is there's nothing wrong with erotica, right? Erotica has ancient roots and it's an important part of human history. The problem with porn and the distinction between them is the business model, right? Pornographers are not making a statement about sex. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get your attention. And what we have are effectively competing companies using their sex worker employees to get your attention, and that creates competition, right? If what you're doing is depicting humans having sex with each other, there's nothing novel about that. How are you going to get your product into people's computer screens when you've got so many competitors? Well, you're going to go to more extreme stuff, right? You're going to paint a picture of sexuality that is inherently more extreme. Where are you going to get the extremes? You're going to get them from taboos, right? You're going to get them from violence and incest and whatever else. And the biggest problem is that very young people see that stuff. And human beings are actually built to discover what sex is supposed to be like. You know, in the Kalahari, the Bushmen frequently learn about sex because they're not fully asleep in the huts where their parents have sex, and they get a sense, therefore, for what sex really looks like, right? That's weird. It feels weird to us moderns, but the point is, if you've got this circuitry that's trying to understand what this sex thing is that's so powerful, and then you've got pornographers putting out this stuff that's all extreme, taboo-driven, economically competitive sex that gets attention, it creates the impression that that's the normal thing. And it's a very wrong impression, right? Erotica doesn't do that, because erotica, not being motivated by the profit motive, is more likely to make an interesting statement. It may be provocative, but it's not driven by the need to get your attention away from somebody else. So
porn also takes the mystery out, right? So, if you're a young person who hasn't yet been naked with someone else, who hasn't yet had a sexual encounter with someone else, it's all a fantasy. It's all in your imagination, and you are wondering lots of things, some of which are possible, some of which aren't, some of which will be pleasurable, some of which won't. Maybe you're wrong on some of those in both directions. But once you start flooding your brain with images and videos of things that people are actually doing, it replaces your own imagination. So it simultaneously cements in place some behaviors that probably aren't healthy. And it also, we like to, it's easy to talk about the kinds of things that happen in porn that are grotesque and that shouldn't be on the menu at all for almost all human beings. But it also limits, right? Like, there's so many things that two people can do with one another. And if what you've seen is some porn, that's kind of going to be what you think is possible, so it's also going to limit what you do sexually and in terms of exploration.
Yeah, the creativity point is huge, and the way to think about it is, this doesn't sound right, but sexual fantasy is a big part of what human beings conjure, right? And there's a reason for that, right? Those fantasies are not, people think they're a free-for-all, but they're not. Your mind is very interested in fantasizing certain things and about certain people, and that affects your behavior in the world. To the extent that you take the exercise of writing sexual narratives in your mind, and you become a consumer of somebody else's narrative that they've built to get your attention, you lose the capacity to be sexually creative. And it's not a capacity you want to surrender. So Heather's right. From what we hear from young people that we talk to, it sounds like sex has become very formulaic, very focused on certain fringe activities, including people wanting to choke each other and things like this that aren't part of a normal relationship. And, I think Those who would defend porn need to just step back and look at it and say, what are the chances that these behaviors are really actually healthy and in my interest? And what are the chances that I've become addicted to some product that somebody wants to sell me and that I need to wean myself away from it for my own good?
Yeah. I know you guys have to get going. I have one more very, very small question. Really easy to answer, totally simple. What is love? What's the evolutionary purpose of love? I mean, I'm sure that, there's the mother-child bond, which makes sense, but in our modern world, I'm not sure that love always makes sense from a reproductive standpoint when we're talking about love relationships, relationships between heterosexual partners, and also homosexual partners, which is a whole other thing. But, love seems like this thing that everyone's always trying to figure out. I'm always trying to figure it out. A lot of it doesn't really make sense. It seems kind of impractical often, torturous. But what does that mean? What does love mean, and why does it exist?
Well, we define it. I must say, I've always loved the lyric, what's love but a secondhand emotion, right? I actually think that that's a really good puzzle, and it's a great way of, delving into the question, and usefully so. We define it in the book. Certain things people swear are difficult to define really aren't. And in this case, love is the prioritization of another or of some other thing at a level that is symmetrical with self, right? It's basically taking something else on at the level of importance that your own well-being has, or greater, right? You can love another individual, you can love your country, but it is a matter of where things fit in your priority hierarchy. Love initially for our lineage started with mothers and offspring, where in order to successfully raise an offspring for a mammal, there was this obligate investment, right? The mother had to go out and find the resources and deliver them and protect the offspring, both as she carried it around and then after it was born. And so that bond, the mother-offspring bond, is the initial love bond. But the argument we make in the book is that once that has been created, and it's been created by selection more than once. So we see this in birds also, for example. Once selection has created this ability to bring another individual into the sense of self, then that can be broadened for other purposes, as it has been in our species, maybe most elaborately, where we do love a partner, and you establish, we talk about, my other half or my better half, right? That's really about self isn't the individual person anymore. It's about a team.
Right, but there's all sorts of relationships that are then possible to have as loving relationships,
sure.
Right? Not just between partners, between bonded partners, but between fathers and children, between siblings, grandparents and children, extended family, friends. Friends are critical for humans, and again, it's not new for us, but friends are critical, and so of course we have love, and then we have love between any individuals. Love is possible between any individuals who have shared fate,
and animals and humans, even dogs and
humans, and then with abstractions, right? Like you can have love of country, and is it exactly the same thing? No, but there's a way in which it's invoked to really trigger the same kinds of sense. If you have love of country, if you are, not a nationalist but a patriot, you are supposed to be willing to sacrifice some things for that country. And people talk about, love of team, love of whatever it is. These abstractions do share, we argue, a common history, albeit a very long ago one, with the original kind of love, which is mother-child.
And then this gets confusing when people abuse the term, I love chocolate. Not really. I guess the last thing to say
he
is
doesn't, for sure.
I like chocolate quite a bit, but I wouldn't say I love it.
I don't love it either. I get it. It's not that great.
It's really good, but anyway, we digress.
You don't want to marry chocolate. I get it.
Right. Exactly. See, that is a bridge too far. But the thing about love is that those relationships can look different. And I just want to highlight the love one has for a partner is a symmetrical kind of love. The love one has for one's children is different. You expect that to be a net flow of well-being from parent to offspring. That's the natural order of things. You don't expect it to be symmetrical. You expect their love to flow, the well-being to flow to their children, to your grandchildren. And so love can look a lot of, and this looks different between humans and different pets, right? The love you have for your dog, I would argue, is a bit more, it's not symmetrical, obviously, but it's much more friendship-like. And with a cat, it's a bit more like a child, right? The cat's not going to defend you in a fight, right? But
you might take bets. And they would win.
It will probably hide under the bed and hope for the best, would be my guess.
Take care of himself, number one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this was a really enjoyable conversation. Again, there's a lot more in this book beyond my personal and sociological obsessions, but I really appreciate it. And it was a really fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I've recommended it to a bunch of people. So I'm glad that you wrote it. And I'm glad, again, that we got the chance to talk. And as always, I hope that someday we'll get to meet in real life. It's been tough these days to do such things, but hopefully someday.
That would be fabulous.
That would be great.
Okay. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, Megan.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.